Okay, so welcome to this lesson. What we're going to do in this is we're going to go through a whole exercise with variables and setting up a bar chart in an SVG. Um, and then we're going to look at some of the code structures that we can affect. So we start here and we start by starting with a couple of variables so that we set our width, and we set up a variable for our height. And we are also going to set up a variable for our padding, which will be based on the gap we want between each of our bars. And we will start off by creating a data set. We'll set up an empty data set, which is equal to an empty array. And then in here, we'll write a for loop, which will loop through 20 numbers, and we will increment it by 1. And for each of those numbers, we want to declare a variable, and we want it to select a random number, so we can use a math function, random, and we say that will select a number between 0 and 1 randomly, and then we want to multiply it by, for example, 50. So we'll end up with numbers between 0 and 50. For each one of those numbers, we want to push it into the data set. So we will say push dot, or dataset dot push, I think. Dataset dot push new number. So we want to then console.log just to check that data set and see how it looks in our browser. So in my browser window, I'm going to open up the inspector, and in here we can see a data set of numbers. Now you can see they're very large float numbers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap this whole piece here in a another math function, which is called round, and we're going to round all those numbers off. So now you end up with a much cleaner data set. The other thing that we want to work out is what our max number is in our data set. And there is a function within D3 where we can say d3.max, and you can pass it an array, which in this case we can do. And what we're going to call that is max number. And that will return the biggest number in the array. So let's console.log that, and we will see what it comes back with. And you can see that it's coming back with our maximum number. So when it generates an array, that max number is able to tell us what the tallest number was. Now what we want to use that max number for is to work out what the scale factor should be. So if the height of our SVG is 500 and our maximum number is 50, then we can scale everything up by 10. So if we take our, we'll call it the scale in the y direction, and we can say scale in the y direction is whatever the height of the SVG is divided by the max number. And we can use this later on in our chart. The other thing we want to include is the padding that we want to, oh, we've already done that up there. Okay, so let's just tidy that code up. Lovely. Now it's time to start building our SVG. So we tell D3 to select body, and we want to append an SVG, and some of the attributes of that SVG will be its width, width, the value will be W, and its height, and its value will be H. So let's see if that is doing what we expect it to do. So we can see inside our body there's an SVG with those attributes on it, ready to go. So now what we'll do is we'll continue with that, and we'll say that we want to start appending some rectangles to it. So first thing we do is we say dot select all rectangles, or recs. Now obviously that will return an empty array, so then we want to start putting data bound elements in. So we tell it what our data is, and that is called dataset, and we then use the enter function to add new data bound elements. I'll just bring this up, and for each of those new we want to append a rectangle as such. So for the moment we'll just see, does that start appending rectangles to them? It does, as you can see there in the window. So the next job we're going to do is we're going to start adding attributes to those rectangles. So the attribute of width, we'll just put in values for the moment, 20. The attribute of height, the attribute of its X position, I'm just going to put them all hard values for the moment, and the attribute of its Y position, and we'll also put in an attribute for its fill. And we can put that in an RGB fashion. Like so. So if I save that and refresh, I'm beginning to see attributes, and they're all in the same position, and they're overlapping each other. So now what we need to start doing is start thinking about where they should go. So firstly, let's look at the width. So the width of each of these rectangles should be whatever the width of the SVG is, divided by the number of elements in the data set. So you could do that with the length function minus the padding. So the width of each of these will vary depending on the value. The X position, well, the X position is primarily a product of the position in the array. So the first one is at a particular, the next one is further in the X direction, third one is further in the X direction. So it's really a function of I. And so to do that, we need to call function d comma I, and then we want to return whatever I is multiplied by the same way we calculated the width, so dataset.length. And that will start placing them in different positions across the screen. You can see their X position is incrementally going up by 25 because correctly. Okay. So the height is obviously a function of d, but d will only give us a number between 0 and 50, so we're going to use that d value and then multiply it by our scale, which we worked out up there. So it is a function of d, we don't need to pass I, and we say return whatever d is multiplied by the y scale factor. So you can see now that's beginning to put that into the correct position. Now, the y position, you can see is at 20, so it's incorrect, but the y position is, we need to move down. So it's really, it's relative to the height. So we can use the exact function that we did there. So we can say it's a function of d, and we want to return h, and we need to take away the d multiplied by the y scale. Okay, so that'll turn it back up into the right height. And the last piece of it is that we need to change the color. So we're going to make them only affect the blue value in this case. So that's the value we want to change. So we're going to concatenate this string. So I'm going to open this out like this. So I want to concatenate that piece. Like that, I think. Let's just check that still works. Yeah. And what I need to do is, this is another function of d, so I need to say function of d, curly brackets, and then we want to return this value, and that will be the end of that there. Okay, so let's just tidy this up, and what I want to change that to is d. Now that will give us a value between 0 and 50, so we want between 0 and 55, so or 255, I'll just multiply it by 5, and then we end up with a chart with varying heights, varying widths, and that all is fine. So the last thing that we need to look at is, as you go on and you start affecting many attributes, this can get very long. So it's much easier to split this out. So let's start looking at how we can do that. So if we end that selection there, which is select the body, append the SVG. Now we can go in here and say d3 dot select whatever SVG is, and then select all rectangles in it, and append all the rectangles. We could then stop that there and say, now I want you to go in d3 dot select SVG, and I want you to dot select all rectangles, and then I want you to add those attributes. So that's much neater. Now, what is even easier to that is that if you declare this as a variable and you say, okay, this var is my SVG and it's equal to that, we can then say select my SVG and select all the rectangles. And if we make that SVG equal to your rectangles, you can then say here, instead of a big long one, we can just say rectangles. So it makes your code much easier. So what we can then do is start putting in some comments like set your variables here, and we can come down here and say set up your data set. And we can say here add your SVG, then add your rectangles, and then set the attributes of your rectangles. Okay, so it's much neater and much easier to manage, and much smarter way to do it. Okay.